It calls itself the crossroads of America. But when you leave Indiana's highways, that's when you discover the true heart of this Midwest state. The richness of its land, surprising, pristine shores, and towering monuments in its urban core. It's a state full of surprises, but it's also played an important role in the nation's history. It was in Indiana that a savvy frontiersman outsmarted the British to help nearly double the size of the nation. And it's where native tribes suffered a humiliating defeat in a key battle of America's Indian Wars. Abraham Lincoln called its soil the place that grew the bread that formed my bones. But Indiana is also where sports legend Larry Bird first played hoops, and where the future king of pop first thrilled fans in a once booming steel town as one of the Jackson Five. When Indiana's home teams go to battle, there's nothing quite like Hoosier hysteria. Just as there's no sound like the roar of one of the biggest, fastest, and loudest events in professional sports. It's much more than just a crossroads. It's the heart and soul of the American Midwest. This is Indiana. Every Memorial Day, for more than 100 years, thousands have flocked to the city of Indianapolis to take part in one of the greatest spectacles in professional sports. This city isn't just the state capital, it's also the racing capital of the world. Home of the legendary Indianapolis 500. When race day arrives, hundreds of thousands pack these bleachers at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, waiting to hear the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines." That's the signal for the 33 Indy 500 drivers to fire up their cars, put pedal to the metal, and kick off what's known as the greatest spectacle in racing. Specially designed IndyCar race cars can reach speeds of more than 230 miles per hour. They're some of the fastest cars in the world. The first 500-mile race was run here in 1911 and drew 90,000 people. They cheered on Ray Haroon as he roared to victory in his bright yellow and black Marmon Wasp, a car that he helped design and build right here in Indianapolis. Haroon averaged 75 miles per hour. His legendary Wasp is now on display along with 30 other Indy 500 winning cars here in the Hall of Fame Museum, which stands right in the middle of the speedway. A few things have changed since that first race besides the top speeds. The crowd has grown to about 300,000, and now millions more watch on TV. And the purse has ballooned from around $30,000 to more than $14 million. Famously known as the Brickyard, the Indy track was once paved with more than 3 million bricks. Today, just this one strip of the original bricks remains to mark the race's start and finish line. Indianapolis may be famous for one of the biggest professional sporting events on earth, but it's also America's amateur sports capital. Indianapolis's Victory Field has been called the best minor league ballpark in America. This downtown park seats over 14,000 and is home to the Indianapolis Indians, the AAA affiliate of the Pittsburgh Pirates. One of Indianapolis's greatest amateur sports victories was even turned into a Hollywood hit, the film Hoosiers, starring Gene Hackman. The real story happened here at the Hinkle Fieldhouse and starred the Milan High School Indians. The film depicted the team as underdogs, but in real life, they were anything but. The Indians were actually a winning team and made it to the Final Four in 1953. The next season, they were fighting for the state championship against their rivals, the powerful Muncie Central Bearcats. The game was tied when Bobby Plump, with just 18 seconds left, made the 14-foot game-winning shot, and Milan beat Muncie 32-30. The win is known as the Milan Miracle. The movie Hoosiers was filmed here where that match was played. Plenty of professional athletes have passed through this field house since then, including Indiana's local hero, NBA star Larry Bird. He played college ball here as a forward with the Indiana State Sycamores before joining the Boston Celtics. After retiring from the Celtics, the three-time MVP came home to Indiana. He joined the NBA's Indiana Pacers as head coach in 1997. Today, the team's home stadium is Bankers Life Fieldhouse in downtown Indianapolis. At the beginning of his professional career, Larry Bird jokingly called himself the Hick from French Lick. That's the name of the rural southern Indiana town where Bird grew up. French Lick lies 100 miles south of Indianapolis. This small hill town sits right on the edge of the 200,000-acre Hoosier National Forest, the largest piece of protected forest land in the state. Bird's family had a hard time making ends meet and lived in this modest house right near French Lick Creek. He grew up practicing jump shots on a hoop mounted on the family's garage. Bird first showed signs of greatness just a few blocks away at Springs Valley High School. French Lick is named for its mineral springs, where wildlife once came to lick dried salt. French trappers and traders set up an outpost here in 1729. Then, over a century later, in 1845, a doctor named William Bowles opened the French Lick Springs Hotel and promoted the area's mineral water for its healing properties. A few years later, another doctor opened a competing hotel just a mile away in a town that was renamed West Baden after Germany's famous spa. Its giant red dome became the region's star attraction. Called the eighth wonder of the world, it was the largest free-span dome ever built when it opened in 1902. In the Roaring '20s, French Lick was one of the country's most famous party towns, home to clubs, hotels, and illicit gambling. Today, a new casino in French Lick has made it again one of the state's biggest attractions. Indiana is now one of the top 4 gambling markets in the nation. But the heart and soul of Indiana's economy isn't the fortunes that cross its gaming tables. It's the richness of its soil. Close to 60% of Indiana land is devoted to farming. Farmers here produce a wide variety of crops that feed the nation and the world, including vast fields of soybeans. They are also major producers of corn, and every year, 270 million pounds of it ends up as popcorn. One of the state's biggest producers is family-owned Pop Weaver, founded by Reverend Ira Weaver in 1928. Today, the process is state-of-the-art. Scientists have discovered that corn kernels pop best when they have 14% moisture. That's why batches of corn are loaded into dozens of individual silos. Each silo is specially designed to allow air to be blown across the kernels to dry them until they have the perfect moisture level. Then they're loaded into trucks, ready for cleaning, sifting, sorting, packaging, and finally, popping. Once, Ira Weaver shucked and bagged his own crop and delivered it to customers in a horse-drawn carriage. Now, his popcorn is sold in 90 countries worldwide. About the same time that Ira Weaver was getting into the popcorn business, another Hoosier was making history by launching a crime wave that would turn him into America's public enemy #1 and into a major story for Hollywood. This heavily guarded concrete wall surrounds one of Indiana's maximum security prisons. The state's Pendleton Correctional Facility is home to almost 1,800 prisoners at any given time. But back in 1924, it was known as the Indiana State Reformatory and housed a man who was about to become one of America's most notorious criminals, a legendary gangster named John Dillinger. He was born in Indianapolis and was a teenager when his father moved the family to Mooresville. He was hoping farm life would straighten out his delinquent son. It didn't work. By the time Dillinger was 21, he was locked up doing 10 to 20 years for robbing and assaulting a Mooresville grocer. He entered jail as a petty thief, but when he was released in 1933, his harsh and lengthy prison sentence had turned him into a hardened and bitter criminal. Within weeks, he and his gang were captivating the American public with brazen bank robberies and prison breaks that sealed his fate as one of America's most notorious gangsters. In January 1934, Dillinger was finally caught, arrested, and sent here to the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. The front part of this building was the sheriff's house. The large building in back was the jail where Dillinger was locked up. The charges against him included murder for the death of a police officer killed in a shootout during a bank robbery. At the time, the prison was considered escape-proof. Sheriff Lillian Hawley is reported to have said, "I know he's a bad baby and a jailbreaker, but I can handle him." Dillinger, on the other hand, had no intention of staying in Crown Point. Within 2 months, he managed to escape by threatening guards with a fake wooden gun stained black with shoe polish. He then grabbed some real guns, locked the guards in a cell, and ran out the front door, making his getaway in Sheriff Hawley's own car. But by crossing the Indiana state line, Dillinger committed a federal crime, and the FBI was soon hot on his tail. The U.S. Attorney General at the time called him public enemy #1. And less than 5 months later, Dillinger was dead, killed by FBI agents in a hail of bullets outside a Chicago theater. Actor Johnny Depp played the role of Indiana's famous gangster in the 2009 film Public Enemies. The real Dillinger is buried here in Indianapolis in Crown Hill Cemetery. Even today, he still ranks high on the list of famous Hoosiers. But the one who made the biggest mark on the nation was Abraham Lincoln. In 1816, Lincoln's family moved from Kentucky to this piece of land near Little Pigeon Creek in southern Indiana. At the time, it was still a wild place covered with forests of hickory, maple, and oak. Today, the site is home to the Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial. A reconstructed log cabin now stands near the site where Lincoln's father, Thomas, built a similar frontier home for his family of 4. And it's here that Nancy Hanks Lincoln died when her son was just 9 years old. Lincoln would later say, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." 4 of the family's original 160 acres have been turned into a living historical farm that offers a glimpse of what life was like for Indiana's early settlers like the Lincolns. Though he was just a boy, Abraham helped his parents cultivate this land and fashion their farm out of the forest. "This was the very spot," he later said, "where grew the bread that formed my bones." Not far from the old Lincoln farmhouse is this memorial to the nation's 16th president. On the walls are 13-foot-tall sculpted limestone panels depicting key moments in Lincoln's life. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21, his family left Indiana to try farm life on the prairies of Illinois, a state that would soon claim him as its own, calling itself the Land of Lincoln. But as the Lincolns were moving on, new settlers were arriving in Indiana. In 1830, those who lived here in the village of New Pekin, a former southern Indiana stagecoach stop, celebrated their first Independence Day. And they've been doing it every year since, making New Pekin the site of the longest consecutive 4th of July celebration in the nation. There are more than 200 entries each year, with everything from farm tractors, to fire trucks, to classic cars, to the high school marching band. Just about everybody in the area participates, whether they're in the parade or cheering from the sidelines. But long before the land that's now Indiana was part of an independent nation, it was home to an ancient and mysterious culture. Its members settled here on the banks of the Ohio River, which now flows along Indiana's southern border with Kentucky. These earthworks at Angel Mound State Historic Site were once the heart of a thriving community called the Mississippian culture. Up to 1,500 people lived here, beginning around 1000 AD. The town covered about 100 acres and was a center for government, trade, and religion. Archaeologists believe that the community's most important buildings were constructed on top of the largest mounds. They may have been temples or homes of a village chief. The Mississippian people were the first in North America to build permanent communities of thousands of people and do extensive farming. They grew corn to help them survive Indiana's cold winters. But around 1400, the Mississippian people left the area, moving further west along the Ohio River. By about 1600, they were gone from Indiana completely. But new people followed in their footsteps. The Miami was the primary Native American tribe that inhabited the land that would later become Indiana. Thanks to its riches, many others migrated here too, including the Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Delaware, and Shawnee. All were members of the Algonquin Nation. But trouble started brewing when Europeans arrived. First, it was the French, then the British, and then the Americans who began fanning out to settle the West. All of them coveted Indian land. By the time of America's War of Independence, the British were still in control of a vast region that stretched south from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. But the Americans wanted this land so they could expand their settlements west. To try and keep them out, British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton encouraged the region's Indian tribes to raid American settlements. Little did Hamilton know, he was about to be outsmarted by a frontiersman named George Rogers Clark. In the summer of 1778, Clark and a small force of about 175 men set out down the Ohio River. Their mission was to seize British-controlled outposts. The approaching winter didn't stop them. They trekked nearly 200 miles in the cold, sometimes wading up to their necks in freezing water. Finally, on the night of February 23, 1779, they crossed the Wabash and arrived here in the town of Vincennes, where Hamilton had his base in a fort that no longer exists. Clark instructed his soldiers to surround the British fort and then light fires, so they looked more like an army of 500. It was a brilliant strategy that worked. Hamilton agreed to lay down his arms. Clark met Hamilton here at St. Francis Xavier Church, one of Vincennes' oldest landmarks today. He demanded unconditional surrender. To send a clear message about what could happen to the British if they refused, Clark brutally and publicly executed 5 members of Hamilton's Indian raiding parties using Indian axes or tomahawks. Terrified and outsmarted, Hamilton surrendered and marched his troops out of town the next day. A few years later, in 1783, at the Treaty of Paris, the British would ultimately cede to the United States an expanse of land west of the Appalachians that was nearly as large as the original 13 colonies. Today, an impressive granite memorial to George Rogers Clark celebrates his role in securing this vast new piece of territory for American settlement. In 1787, a large piece of the land that Clark helped secure became America's Northwest Territory. It would ultimately end up being the states of Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. It was land that nearly doubled the size of the United States at the time. But this area was still Indian land, and tribes were soon under increasing pressure as more and more Americans began migrating west. In order for Indiana to qualify for statehood, the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, encouraged settlement every way he could. Harrison felt that Indiana's land belonged to America and that Native Americans were only in the way. He pushed through multiple treaties, convincing tribal leaders to sign away tens of millions of acres. But a Shawnee chief named Tecumseh refused to comply. Tecumseh and his brother were disturbed by the increasing numbers of settlers encroaching on Indian land. They believed that the only hope for the tribes was to unite. In 1808, they founded a village here on the banks of the Wabash River called Prophetstown and invited other tribes to live here and join in resistance against the government. These buildings are replicas of just a few of the dwellings that once blanketed this vast field. In 1809, at the Treaty of Fort Wayne, Harrison convinced several other tribal leaders to sign over 3 million acres of their land for just 2 cents an acre. It was the last straw for Tecumseh. He decided to retaliate by vowing to attack white settlers. But Harrison got word of the plan and decided to launch his own preemptive strike while Tecumseh was away recruiting other tribes to his cause. On November 6, 1811, Harrison and about 1,000 troops pitched camp near Prophetstown, here on the nearby Tippecanoe River. Early the next morning, Tecumseh's brother, known as the Prophet, decided to strike, convincing his warriors that his own special powers would make them victorious. They hit Harrison's troops hard in what was a bloody battle, but the Indians were unable to deal them the quick, decisive blow the Prophet had promised. Disillusioned, many warriors left the battlefield. 2 days later, Harrison's soldiers moved in and burned Prophetstown to the ground. The Battle of Tippecanoe would be a turning point in the Indians' doomed quest to hold on to their land. Tecumseh continued his fight against white settlement, but was killed 2 years later in 1813 by another force, which happened to be led by Harrison himself. By 1816, Indiana was being prepared for statehood, here in the territorial capital of Corydon. Inside this stone marker is the trunk of a famous tree known as the Constitution Elm. It was under the boughs of this once stately elm that 43 delegates met in June 1816 to draft the state's first constitution. Months later, the state's first Capitol building opened in the center of town. And then on December 19, 1816, Indiana was finally admitted as the 19th state of the nation. Thanks to its rich soil and the many natural waterways that wind through its fields, outsiders have been drawn to the land that's now Indiana for centuries. That's how one of the most unique towns in America, called New Harmony, got its start. Back in 1814, a German spiritual leader named Johann Georg Rapp, along with his adopted son, Frederick, and about 800 followers, purchased 20,000 acres here on the banks of the Wabash River. They were separatists from the German Lutheran Church and wanted a place where they could freely practice their faith. They called themselves Harmonists, and their new town, Harmony. The Harmonists were intensely spiritual and celibate. They believed that Christ could return at any moment and that new converts, not children, would allow their community to grow. Faith was at the heart of everything the harmonists did, which is why they planted a labyrinth on the south edge of town for peaceful contemplation. They were also extremely industrious. Within just a few years, Harmony was not only self-sufficient, it was one of the most prosperous towns in Indiana. Impressive buildings lined its streets, including this stone granary. What they made here, from boots and harnesses to wagons and whiskey, was sold as far away as New Orleans. But after a decade, Rapp decided to sell Harmony and take his followers to Pennsylvania, so they weren't so isolated and could be closer to other German immigrants. But new settlers were pouring into the state. By 1825, with the state's population growing, government officials started looking for a more central location for the capital. They chose a permanent site right in the middle of the state and named it Indianapolis. The new capital needed a new state house. The first one had to be torn down due to shoddy construction. It wasn't until 1888 that a grand new state building made from Indiana limestone was towering over town. But the heart of Indianapolis today isn't its Capitol building, it's this stunning obelisk, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, built to honor Indiana veterans of the Civil War. It was the first memorial of its size in the nation to recognize the sacrifices of the common soldier. A bronze statue of victory tops its peak. Today, this is Indiana's official memorial to all the Hoosiers who served in conflicts up until World War I, soldiers it calls the silent victors. Together with its circle, fountains, and other sculptures, it provides Indianapolis with a stunning centerpiece. For years, this spire was the tallest thing in the city, but today, skyscrapers soar above the Indianapolis skyline. The tallest is Chase Tower at 49 stories. It looks out over a city known for its unique public spaces. Indianapolis is located on the White River. Once upon a time, lawmakers here had high hopes of connecting the city to a canal system they planned for the entire state. The canal became obsolete before it was finished, but industrious Hoosiers turned what had already been built into an urban oasis. Today, that canal is the centerpiece of Indianapolis's 250-acre White River State Park. On summer days, anyone can paddle right through the heart of the city, or follow the canal walking path as far as the world-renowned Indianapolis Museum of Art. Founded in 1883, it's one of the largest and oldest art museums in the country. Many of its most famous works are outside, in an art park known as 100 Acres. It's built on the site of a former quarry. Some of these works are best seen from the air. It's art that's meant to be climbed on, played with, and even lived in. This fiberglass pod is known as Indianapolis Island and was created by artist Andrea Zittel. Each summer, one or two artists commit to living in this floating fiberglass pod in order to explore what it means to live alone, on an island, right in the middle of a modern city. Hoosiers are proud of a lot of things in their state, but nothing tops their football team, the Indianapolis Colts. They play here at Lucas Oil Stadium, designed in the style of a vintage field house right in downtown Indy. Back in the 1980s, the Colts were a Baltimore team, but owner Robert Irsay was arguing with state officials. He thought the Colts should have a new stadium. Baltimore said no, but Indianapolis just happened to have a brand new one, right here in the heart of the city, and it was in need of a team. So, in March 1984, in the dead of night, 15 moving vans secretly loaded up the team's gear and headed here to Indiana. The covert operation is known as the Colts Midnight Ride. People in Indiana are keen on competition, whether it's the NFL, the Indy 500, or Big Ten basketball. But sometimes they also go to battle for nature. Here on the shores of Lake Michigan, One of those battles was over a stretch of shoreline known as the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. Indiana has the smallest shoreline of any of the Great Lakes states, and this 15-mile stretch of it happens to be one of the state's greatest natural treasures. It covers 15,000 acres of dunes, forests, hiking trails, and some of the best beaches on Lake Michigan. 3 million people visit the lakeshore each year, more than any other destination in Indiana. Locals cherish this stretch of sand, especially because it almost disappeared. Back in the 1800s, a 200-foot-high dune known as the Hoosier Slide soared over Indiana's lakeshore. But it was carted away for glass manufacturing, trainload by companies like the Ball Brothers of Muncie, Indiana, who used the sand to make glass jars for canning. So starting in 1899, local dune lovers began waging a fight to protect this amazing stretch of coast. The battle lasted almost 70 years, until 1966, when Congress authorized the creation of the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. Today, it's a popular spot for visitors from near and far. They all come to enjoy this wild shore and the views it offers of one of America's Great Lakes. But giant industry also thrives on Lake Michigan. Right at the end of the dunes soar the towering chimneys of one of Indiana's many steel mills. This one is owned by the largest steel company in the world, ArcelorMittal. Its 5 blast furnaces turn iron ore, coke, limestone, and scrap into about 9.5 million tons of raw steel a year. It's part of a string of mills that line Indiana's tiny coast, just as they have for more than 100 years. They reach right up through East Chicago, Indiana, that is, which actually lies just south of Chicago itself. Back in the 1910s and 20s, factory jobs lured tens of thousands of immigrants to this area. Many lived in slums and tenements. But a few lived here, in an oasis of clapboard homes, grassy yards, and swimming pools. This is Marktown, founded in 1917 by steel mill owner Clayton Mark. It's one of only a few planned towns for American workers that are still standing today. Mark believed that a stable and clean living environment would make a more productive workforce, so he built this neighborhood for his workers. Today, nearby industries have grown and pretty much surrounded Marktown, but it's still home to about 500 and is on the National Register of Historic Places. Indiana's early 20th century steel boom was so big, companies also helped create entire cities. Nearby Gary, Indiana, was one of the biggest. By the 1950s, almost 200,000 people lived and worked here, in what was a thriving boom town, less than 30 miles from downtown Chicago. It was also the birthplace of the king of pop, Michael Jackson. In the 1950s, Michael Jackson's father, Joe, worked here at Gary's U.S. Steel plant, which is still in operation today. When his shifts were over, he headed home to the family's tiny 2-bedroom house. His son, Michael, born on August 29, 1958, grew up here with his 8 brothers and sisters. Joe was a musician, and Michael would later say that their house was always bursting with music. Today, a steady stream of Michael Jackson's fans still stop by the house to see where the king of pop got his start. A few blocks away, Michael attended the one-story Garnett Elementary School and often dashed home to rehearse with his brothers. It was here at Roosevelt High School in 1966 that the Jacksons won a citywide talent show with their signature Jackson 5 dance moves and perfect coordination. When it came time to perform their first paid gig, they did it right here in Gary at Mr. Lucky's Lounge. The pay wasn't much, but the crowds loved them. When the Jackson 5 hit the big time in 1969, they moved to Los Angeles with a Motown Records contract. not long after, the steel companies began leaving Gary, Indiana too, taking their business overseas. And as the jobs fled, so did Gary's population. This city, which had been one of Indiana's greatest, slipped into decline. Remnants of Gary's golden age can be seen in its architectural ruins. Its massive Methodist church on Washington Street was once the heart of the community. Now it lies dilapidated and abandoned. It's been featured in movies like Nightmare on Elm Street and Transformers 3. Broadway Avenue was once Gary's bustling commercial center with thriving shops, crowded restaurants, and the famous Palace Theater. Today, just about every store on this block has closed, and the roofs of most of its downtown buildings have fallen in. One of the biggest symbols of this steel town's decline is the Ambassador Apartment Building. It used to be home to steel company managers and executives. Now, it's being reclaimed by nature. But today, the city of Gary is hoping for a comeback. Its new mayor has big plans to revitalize Gary's downtown and its neighborhoods. Michael Jackson's block is one of the first on the list. But while Gary may be an example of what can happen when booming cities fall on hard times, Indiana is also home to one of the best examples of a thriving small town in America. A place where workers build the engines that power some of the nation's most popular pickups. At first glance, Columbus, Indiana might seem like any other small American town. That is, until you cross its very unique Robert N. Stewart Bridge, a fully suspended bridge that was actually the first of its kind in North America. This architecturally innovative gateway is a fitting entrance to a town that's practically a museum of modernist architecture. It all began with J. Irwin Miller, head of the Cummins Engine Company. Cummins diesel engines have powered every Dodge Ram light-duty pickup since the late 1980s. Today, Cummins is the largest employer in Columbus. Miller was almost as passionate about modern art and architecture as he was about diesel technology, as can be seen in the company's corporate headquarters, designed by Pritzker Prize-winning architect Kevin Roche. He also famously believed in doing things right. Mediocrity, he used to say, is expensive. So, beginning in the mid-1950s, Miller offered, through his Cummins Foundation, to pay for first-rate architects to design the town's public buildings. The idea took off, and today, the city is filled with dozens of structures commissioned under the foundation. The very first architect that Miller lured to town was Eliel Saarinen, who brought the clean lines of modernism to Columbus in 1942 with the first Christian church. This building, with its geometric design and its own 166-foot-high freestanding bell tower, was one of the first modernist churches in America. The city's architecture attracts visitors from all over the world, but few ever get to see it from the air. There's no better way to appreciate the sleek triangular lines of City Hall than from above. Next door is probably the prettiest lockup in America, the elegant Bartholomew County Jail, crowned by a wire mesh dome for outdoor recreation. Not far away is this AT&T switching station, which has been redesigned with colorful intake and exhaust pipes to cool the equipment inside the building. Today, thanks to its impressive downtown buildings, the American Institute of Architects ranks Columbus as one of the top 6 architecturally important cities in the country. But Indiana itself also has a rich mix of architectural treasures, old and new. One of the most impressive lies just 130 miles west of Columbus. It's a place called St. Meinrad Arch Abbey. Built in 1907, St. Meinrad is now home to 95 Benedictine monks, whose lives are dedicated to prayer and work. The monastery dates back to 1854, when Swiss monks came at the request of a local priest who needed help serving Indiana's growing German-speaking Catholic community. Soon, the monks were teaching theology to students. Today, St. Meinrad is also a seminary and a theology school. If a colossal Catholic abbey is a surprising outcrop in the Indiana farmland, so are these sacred Buddhist monuments, called stupas, tucked among the trees in Bloomington, Indiana. This is the Tibetan-Mongolian Buddhist Cultural Center, founded by the Dalai Lama's older brother. When the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet in 1950, he escaped and settled in the United States, eventually becoming a professor of Tibetan studies at Indiana University. Founded in 1979, this center is devoted to preserving Tibetan culture and religion, which is under siege inside Tibet. Religion has played an important role in Indiana's history and education. Here in South Bend is one of the most prestigious schools in the country, the University of Notre Dame. Its long list of famous alumni include former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, football greats Joe Montana and Knute Rockne, and several NASA astronauts. The centerpiece of the university is its famous Golden Dome, and is why graduates of Notre Dame are called domers. The 19-foot statue of the Virgin Mary on top is based on one in Rome, commissioned by Pope Pius IX. With its doors open to all faiths, Indiana has attracted people from near and far. One reason is that it's easy to get to from just about anywhere. Indianapolis lies at the heart of America's highway system. Major arteries radiate out from this city like giant spokes. 14 interstates cross through Indiana, more than through any other state. They're one reason that 65% of Americans live within just a day's drive of Indianapolis, and why Indiana is known today as the crossroads of America. Many of the cars and trucks that ride in this impressive network of American highways are made right here in the state. Here at the General Motors plant in Fort Wayne, more than 1,400 Chevy and GMC trucks roll out of the assembly line each day. When each truck is finished, it's filled with 3 gallons of gas and takes a test drive around this quarter-mile track. If it passes the test, the finished truck rolls onto the giant car lot and waits its turn to be shipped off to markets in one of these train cars. While trucks may be the vehicles of choice for many Hoosiers, it was a story about bicycle racing that gave many Americans their first taste of Indiana, thanks to the 1979 Academy Award-winning film, Breaking Away. It starred Dennis Quaid and Daniel Stern and was filmed here in Bloomington. The coming-of-age movie tells the story of 4 local teens who are adrift after high school and decide to compete against their Indiana University rivals in the annual Little 500 bicycle race. The actual event, modeled on the Indy 500, takes place here at the Bill Armstrong Stadium on the Indiana University campus. In the film, Dave, played by Dennis Christopher, manages to win the race with his feet taped to the pedals so he won't give up. Founded in 1820, Indiana University is one of the top public schools in the country. IU is also one of the top places for college sports, with 24 national championship teams and some 140 individual NCAA titles. All of its teams are known by the state's name, the Hoosiers. No one knows where this term actually came from, though there are dozens of legends. The one most likely is that back in the 1800s, Hoosier referred to the rough-hewn frontier folk who first settled in Indiana. Today, Hoosiers is likely the most widely used nickname of any state in the nation. Hoosier football is played here at Memorial Stadium, and IU's rivalry with another Indiana football team, Purdue University's Boilermakers, is one of the most heated in Big Ten college sports. There's no question that Hoosiers are industrious and proud of their state and their accomplishments. Whether they're mining riches from this Indiana earth, growing a bounty of vegetables on their verdant farmland, building some of the greatest architecture in America, or racking up NCAA championships on the basketball court. And whatever the origin of their nickname, Hoosiers wear it proudly as a symbol of the rugged individualism and independent spirit that built this state, Indiana.